national park that covers 27,000 square kilometers of mountain forest. Nearly 2,000 wild pandas are living freely and producing here. Setting eco-red line, building national parks, establishing nature reserves, and keeping a distance from wild species reflect people's willingness to restrain their own behavior and to give way to wild species. The germplasm resource banks and gene banks around the country hold the survival code of millions of species, protecting the valuable assets for humankind. Forest conservation and the holistic conservation and restoration of mountain, river, forest, farmland, lake, grassland, and desert ecosystems are bringing back lucid waters, lush mountains, blue sky, and white clouds.
像保护眼睛一样保护自然和生态环境。这个理念在中国深入人心。在这里，曾经灭绝的麋鹿不但恢复了种群数量，还被成批野化放归大自然。
Thanks to the unremitting efforts by China, many extinct or endangered wild species are regaining confidence and dignity. The elevation of Yunnan varies from 70 meters to 6,700 meters. It's a kingdom of animals and plants. People's efforts to protect biological diversity is speeding up at the moment. China is taking actions to accomplish the mission. Human beings have put forward a proposal to protect the biological diversity and to build a shared future for all life on Earth.
在这里，有一只胸怀世界的小鸟。每年秋季，小小的北京雨燕开始迁飞，一路穿越37个国家，最终抵达南非高原。
For them, the Earth is a whole. The countries they fly across are all homes. No matter they are big or small, powerful or weak, rich or poor. Humans are to coexist harmoniously with nature and all things on Earth. China will work together with the world to protect this planet we call home.
在这里，我们的祖先祭祀天地，祈愿风调雨顺，谷物丰收。
The elegant Chinese characters were inspired by the beauty of life in nature. The classical Book of Songs expresses the sincere feelings through describing various beings in the world. The Chinese civilization has always respected and loved nature and valued the harmony between man and nature. Giant pandas are a species from 8 million years ago. China has set up the Giant Panda National Park that covers 27,000 square kilometers of mountain forest. Nearly 2,000 wild pandas are living freely and producing here. Setting eco-red line, building national parks, establishing nature reserves, and keeping a distance from wild species reflect people's willingness to restrain their own behavior and to give way to wild species. The germplasm resource banks and gene banks around the country hold the survival code of millions of species, protecting the valuable assets for humankind. Forest conservation and the holistic conservation and restoration of mountain, river, forest, farmland, lake, grassland, and desert ecosystems are bringing back lucid waters, lush mountains, blue sky, and white clouds.
像保护眼睛一样保护自然和生态环境。这个理念在中国深入人心。在这里，曾经灭绝的麋鹿不但恢复了种群数量，还被成批野化放归大自然。
Thanks to the unremitting efforts by China, many extinct or endangered wild species are regaining confidence and dignity. The elevation of Yunnan varies from 70 meters to 6,700 meters. It's a kingdom of animals and plants. People's efforts to protect biological diversity is speeding up at the moment. China is taking actions to accomplish the mission. Human beings have put forward a proposal to protect the biological diversity and to build a shared future for all life on Earth.
在这里，有一只胸怀世界的小鸟。每年秋季，小小的北京雨燕开始迁飞，一路穿越37个国家，最终抵达南非高原。
For them, the Earth is a whole. The countries they fly across are all homes. No matter they are big or small, powerful or weak, rich or poor. Humans are to coexist harmoniously with nature and all things on Earth. China will work together with the world to protect this planet we call home.
Dear Ministers, Delegates, Excellencies, welcome back to the afternoon plenary of the high-level segment. I'm the head of the Chinese delegation, Vice Minister of the Chinese Ministry of Ecosystem and the Environment. Very honored to be presiding over the proceedings of the meeting on behalf of Mr. Huang. Before we reopen the floor to hear more national statements, it is my pleasure to have 3 keynote speakers with us today. I would like to invite our first speaker, Mr. Juan Carlos Salazar Secretary General of the International Civil Aviation Organization, to address the room. I'll give you the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure and honor to be with you for this high-level segment of the second part of the Biodiversity Conference. Allow me to express my sincere gratitude to the Ministry of Ecology and Environment of China for inviting me to address you today as part of this important event on the future of our biosphere. As many of you may know, I did not have to travel far to join you today. That is because the headquarters of the International Civil Aviation Organization, the specialized agency of United Nations dealing with civil aviation, and the only UN agency that has headquarters here in Canada, is located not far from here in this wonderful city of Montreal. This fortunate geographic proximity between COP-15 and ICAO reflects an even stronger connection between us. And by that, of course, I am referring to our respective sustainability objectives. When it comes to protecting our planet, biodiversity and climate are two sides of the same coin. And we were very much encouraged that ICAO member states were able to progress their climate ambitions in their respective international aviation at ICAO's recently conclude 41st Assembly. The Assembly's newly adopted resolution on a long-term global aspirational goal of net zero CO2 emissions from international aviation by 2050 marks the start of a journey for civil aviation, and one which will serve to accelerate our sector's ultimate decarbonization. To achieve this objective, countries will rely on measures delivering concrete in-sectors emission savings, more efficient operations, aircraft technology, the deployment of sustainable aviation fuels, and many other bold innovations now being conceptualized and realized will all be essential to its success. Important complementary contributions to these innovations will be made by ICAO's aircraft CO2 standards, which will begin applying to aircraft type designs as soon as next month, when the new standards become applicable internationally, and by the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, also known as CORSIA, the first global carbon offsetting and reduction solution for any industry sector. Biodiversity is an important consideration in much of ICAO's work, including in areas such as aerial forest fire mitigation, species protection near airports, the prevention of wildlife trafficking, and perhaps more importantly at the moment, the deployment of sustainable aviation fuels. ICAO member states have recently adopted a comprehensive framework concerning the biomass and other sources to be explored for these new fuel types, and one founded upon strict criteria designed to protect biodiversity and promote conservation. Our shared targets to protect our climate, preserve biodiversity, reduce pollution, and build cleaner energy systems are considerable, and addressing them is vital. The UN Biodiversity Conference can count on ICAO as a close and committed partner in support of an appropriate common objectives. I wish you all great success in achieving positive results on the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and look forward to strengthening our ties and leveraging new partnerships as we work together towards our common goals. Thank you very much.
谢谢沙拉扎先生，感谢您的发言。现在有请第二位主旨发言人。
Thank you, Mr. Salazar, for your message. I now invite Ms. Ana Maria Hernandez, Chair of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES for short, to take the floor.
Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to address the high-level segment on behalf of IPBES. We stand at the watershed moment with biodiversity declining faster than ever before in human history and impacting the present and future quality of life on Earth. The COP-15 is considering the global framework that offers our last best chance to reverse this critical situation. IPBES, as you know, has been providing over the last 10 years at the request of its member states a scientific, robust knowledge base on biodiversity compiled in 10 assessments, including the landmark 2019 Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. One clear message from this assessment is that the SDGs will not be achieved on current trajectories and the 2050 vision for biodiversity can only be achieved through transformative changes. To achieve this, it is necessary to address both the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. The global assessment emphasized the 5 most important direct causes of biodiversity loss worldwide, including land and sea use change, overexploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. These direct drivers result from underlying causes rooted in human behaviors, needs, and values, which generate increasing pressures on biodiversity and nature contributions to people. To address these drivers, it is necessary to include targets to generate better institutional, legal, policy, and educational environments with a view to reduce excessive consumption and waste, inequalities, harmful economic incentives, amongst others. It is crucial to include the different values of nature in decision-making at all levels, relying on different knowledge systems. The establishment, expansion, and better management of protected areas are key to preserve biodiversity, but will not protect all biodiversity. In addition to protected areas, actions are needed to place biodiversity at the center of all the sectors of economy. This includes, in particular, actions to transform agriculture and food systems by reducing pesticides and fertilizers, removing harmful subsidies, or rebuilding overfished stocks. It also includes actions to improve freshwater management and connectivity, building sustainable cities, and integrate biodiversity to economic and financial systems, not to mention the urgent need to act on both biodiversity and climate change together. In closing, Your Excellencies, it will be an honor for IPBES to inform the transformative changes needed to achieve the 20 vision for biodiversity. Thank you, merci, gracias.
谢谢埃尔南德斯女士，谢谢您的发言。现在我想有请我们主旨发言环节的第3位发言人。
Thank you, Ms. Hernandez. I now invite our third keynote speaker of the session, Mr. Dario Meja, Chairperson of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I give you the floor, sir. Madam. I give you the floor, sir.
Sisters and brothers, greetings to all of you. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is an advisory body of the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, and it's established to examine Indigenous issues. The UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples gave it the mandate to promote the respect and full application of the provisions of the Declaration. At the 2022 session, The permanent foreman heard directly the contributions and challenges of Indigenous peoples, and this in relation to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I can tell you that Indigenous peoples understand their territory holistically, and the laws of Mother Earth are reflected in the rules of the relationship between the beings of nature, including human beings, so that the separation between culture and nature is not applicable. And this way of life and the integral knowledge systems of Indigenous peoples make a huge contribution. And they represent 6.2% of the global population and protect at least 80% of the remaining biodiversity in the world. So they care for Mother Earth, and this must be recognized. So this is a task that must be acknowledged. The permanent forum has recommended that the Indigenous territories be recognized as a category separate from protected areas or other areas-based conservation measures, and this in Target 3 of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So this is not only an act of coherence, but also of historical justice. And these measures should be included in the relevant targets to develop indicators for Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous women face unique challenges in exercising their role as stewards of their knowledge and protectors of biodiversity, and their views and participation must be recognized without further discussion. In 2023, we will be meeting at the New York headquarters, and this from 17 to 20th April, on the issue of people, states, UN entities, and we invite all Indigenous peoples and states and other stakeholders who join in the debate to share experiences and initiatives for implementing this new biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meja. Thank you for your statement. This concludes our keynote speeches of the session, and I'd like to thank once again Mr. Salazar, Ms. Hernandez, and Mr. Meja for their remarks and for their support to the COP. We shall now continue with the list of speakers from countries in the order we left from our previous session. I once again appeal for your cooperation to keep your statements to the 3-minute limit. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Romina Pourmokhtari, Minister of Climate and the Environment of Sweden.
Delegates, ladies and gentlemen, rest assured, Sweden is here to stop and revert the loss of biodiversity. It is a question of survival for humans and for all the marvelous species inhabiting our green and blue planet. Our societies are deeply dependent on biodiversity in so many ways, not least for human well-being. It is for us to ensure that a new global biodiversity framework covers all necessary aspects and is clear enough to allow for both ambition and progress to be monitored and reviewed. In this context, genetic variation, a small and to the naked eye an invisible part of biodiversity, is crucial. Genetic variation is the insurance we need in a changing climate where species and ecosystems have a need to adapt. Therefore, a goal to maintain 95% of genetic variation to 2050 is of the utmost importance for us. We know funds from all sources are needed to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. ODA alone will not do the trick. The ODA provided must be truly catalytical and mobilize private capital at scale, while contributing to synergies with other objectives, not least climate mitigation and adaptation. Therefore, Sweden is joining the political vision in the 10-point plan for financing biodiversity. The developing countries of the world must contribute. Sweden has pledged approximately $400 million to the GEF-8 replenishment. This makes us the 4th largest contributor and per capita the biggest contributor. We have worked hard in the replenishment to make the window for biodiversity larger, and the biodiversity protection now represents the biggest share of GEF's 8th programming period. But let me be the one to say, if we wish for this COP to be successful, finances will not be enough. We will not make the change necessary and revert the loss of biodiversity without ambitious goals and targets. We need a balanced package. It is essential to agree on a system for monitoring and reviewing the implementation of the framework, as goals without the implementation will leave us running in the dark. We need a comprehensive monitoring system. Together, we can truly make a difference for the future of our planet and for future generations. A successful implementation of the global biodiversity framework is dependent on involvement of many stakeholders, the private sector, financial institutions, civil society, and not least, the youth. We look forward to working with you all on implementing the new framework. Thank you.
谢谢部长阁下的发言。下面邀请尼日利亚环境部部长穆罕默德·哈桑·阿卜杜拉希阁下发言。在尼日利亚之后是智利部长发言。尼日利亚部长，有请。
Thank you, Mr. President, and very distinguished colleagues and excellencies who are here. I'm honored to bring warm greetings to you from Nigeria as we gather to find solutions to the biodiversity and climate crisis that is gripping our planet. I would like to congratulate China for organizing this conference and I appreciate the government and people of Canada for hosting this very important event. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we can no longer look at biodiversity loss and climate change as two different problems. They are part of the same crisis, and we cannot solve one without solving the other. Many of us attended COP-27 in Egypt, CITES COP-19 in Panama, and Ramsar COP-14 in Wuhan, and Geneva as well. From climate adaptation to wildlife trade to wetlands protection, we are talking about addressing the key drivers of biodiversity loss, which both contribute to and cause climate change. What is clear to Nigeria is that we must use all of the tools at our disposal to reduce the threat to biodiversity, and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework must guide our way. But it will never work if we don't take an honest and equitable approach. The African continent is more vulnerable to climate change, species loss, and biodiversity destruction than any other continent. African environmental resources have been hit hard by decades and centuries of exploitation, often perpetuated by other countries. And now, our environment, wildlife, lands, and people are most at risk. And these risks are mostly caused by other countries. But we are leading the way to protect our planet's biodiversity. Because Africa will be the most affected by the biodiversity and climate crisis, we are united in being the most ambitious in protecting our lands, our seas, our wildlife, and our people. African nations have created over 2 million square kilometers of areas that are protected, which is an indication of our joint commitment to the preservation of Africa's rich biodiversity. I wish to reiterate the readiness of the government of Nigeria to implement decisions that will be adopted at this meeting. We are leading the way with our sister ECOWAS nations. Our appeal for an ambitious global response to biodiversity crisis is urgent and focused. Through this urgent appeal, we have identified several measures as essential, including the global designation of 30% of land and ocean areas as protected by 2030, the conclusion of a robust new high seas treaty, the establishment of highly and fully protected areas covering 30% of the global ocean, which prohibit environmentally damaging activities, and a global commitment towards immediately halting human-induced extinction of wild species, among others. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is only part of the solution, as we must also ensure that we are fully prepared to implement the commitments we make for a better planet. We can no longer afford to lose our momentum in endless debate when the solutions are right in front of us. If we fail to act, the impact on people will be profound, and they'll be felt more than they are in Africa right now. Today, we have an urgent plea. We ask that you listen to us. We ask that you trust us. We must act now, and we must be bold if we have any hope of preserving our planet, our people, and our future. Let us act now by building a shared future for all life on Earth. I thank you all for listening.
I thank Your Excellency, Minister, for your remarks. And now I give the floor to the Minister of Environment of Chile, His Excellency Ms. Maria Jalosia Roja. And after that, it will be Côte d'Ivoire. I give the floor to the Minister of Chile.
Señora Secretaria de la Convención.
Distinguished Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Government of China, distinguished President of COP and parties to the convention, and all those present. I come to you from Chile, a long and narrow country at the end of the world, with unique ecosystems and diversity, with a variety of landscapes that vary from the driest desert in the world, and one that blooms magnificently and spontaneously, to the ice fields that are not only an important source of water, but they also enable us to understand the history of our land. Our ecosystems and the biodiversity they present are the life support of all the people who inhabit our country and are fundamental to achieve sustainable development. And it is for this reason that we are committed to protecting them as a way to contribute to the world and to take measures to prevent the deterioration in the face of economic activities, taking into account the triple crisis that we face as humanity, that is climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution. Recalling our participation in COP-27 on climate change, we make ourselves available today for COP-15 negotiations, reaffirming our commitment to multilateralism and to reinforcing the message that this is a global problem and therefore it must be addressed collectively. Coming to agreement on positions amongst parties and providing solutions in keeping with the realities of all developing countries. In accordance with the above, we consider it fundamental that in these negotiations, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework be approved, together with its targets, emphasizing that this new framework must be ambitious, realistic, and applicable. The latter is essential because the implementation of the framework in those countries that are home to most of the world's biodiversity, be they because they're megadiverse or with a high presence of endemic species, they face numerous barriers to obtaining the resources required for these challenges, and consequently, the availability of resources must be increased, along with mobilizing existing resources from all sources so that we can meet the goals and targets of the framework. Mr. President, it's time to take action, and we commit to move forward collectively to protect and conserve at least 30% of land and oceans by 2030, and make a global effort to take into consideration the scientific evidence that sheds light on the land and marine ecosystems, and this in light of the science. So we seek the sustainable environment goals through what we refer to as a just socio-ecological transition, with the inclusion of biodiversity in our public policies and in all sectors, both productive and financial. And in line with our commitment to conservation, we support a framework based on a human rights-based approach, protecting the human rights of environmentalists and the rights and traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities. We reaffirm that the implementation of the framework must be aligned with gender equality and gender perspectives, ensuring the rights of women and girls and their capacity to contribute to the development and fulfillment of the commitments adopted in this convention. Lastly, we reiterate our commitment to the implementation of the post-2020 Global Framework for Biodiversity through the strengthening of our environmental institutional framework. Chile's commitments to climate change includes also a commitment to biodiversity. And similarly, we are committed to working in with a public and private approach through the creation of the Child Nature Fund, and to contribute to reducing biodiversity financing gap in our country. So we call upon parties for the CBD to be flexible and willing to reach agreements. Thank you very much.
I thank Your Excellency Minister for your intervention. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jean-Luc Assis, Minister of Environment and Development, and after that it will be the UK. I give the floor to the Minister of Côte d'Ivoire.
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs,
Your Excellencies, Ministers, Mr. President of COP-15, Madam Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the world is facing a continuous challenge of the degradation of nature. Apart from the generalized threats to biodiversity, we should all take commitments. I'd like to point out that Côte d'Ivoire has a rich biological diversity which is spread throughout its territory. Having taken the full measure of the erosion of its biodiversity, the state is mobilizing and taking action through the adoption of ambitious measures, which are the establishment of ministries in charge of the environment, water and forests, agriculture, animal and fisheries resources, as well as the Ivorian Office of Parks and Reserves. The ratification of major international agreements on the environment, particularly the 3 Rio Conventions and protocols thereto. To this have been added several other texts on water, environment, forestry codes, the Biosafety Act, the Fisheries and Aquaculture Act, the development of a national environment policy, several strategies and plans for the protection of biodiversity. Many other initiatives to reduce biodiversity loss
restore forest cover and increase the resilience of populations to climate change are also underway. Since 1926, Côte d'Ivoire has created a network of protected areas and of protected forests throughout the national territory, covering the total area of 6.5 million hectares. 3 of these natural areas are listed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. These protected areas constitute refuges for a very rich fauna and are home to many endemic and emblematic species. The elephant, the buffalo, the leopard, the lion, and the hippopotamus. Ladies and gentlemen, among other actions, we intend to carry out awareness-raising campaigns to mobilize all stakeholders, including the capacity building on the part of all stakeholders, including the private sector, local governments, women, and youth. The restoration of the Ivorian forest capital through the creation of more than 15,000 hectares of voluntary nature reserves, the restoration of 10,000 hectares of mangroves, the creation of marine protected areas, the Cauca Friend of the Forest Initiative in agreement with the populations in order to contribute to the achievement of 30 by 30 target of the global framework, the object of the coalition to which Côte d'Ivoire belongs. Pressing on with the process of integrating biodiversity protection programs and projects, which is why my country supports the idea of setting up a special fund for the global framework to the tune of 1% of GDP to achieve convincing results. I thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for your intervention. And now I give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Therese Coffey, Secretary of State of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. After that, it will be New Zealand.
Executive Secretary, Excellencies, delegates, my thanks to the governments of China and Canada, the Government of Quebec and their Secretariat. For too long, nature has been overlooked. Flora and fauna are important in and of themselves, and a safe, healthy environment provides both the essential foundation and a powerful engine for our economies. In the United Kingdom, we are using legislation to make timely progress towards our world-leading targets to halt the decline of nature by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Having doubled UK international climate finance to £11.6 billion, we intend to spend at least £3 billion of that on nature. And today, I'm delighted to announce up to £29 million to help nature-rich countries protect and conserve their landscapes, and an additional £17 million through the World Bank's Pro-Blue programme to support the hard work of small island states and least developed countries. By putting land and ocean at the heart of our collective response to the causes and impacts of climate change, for the first time at COP-26 in Glasgow, we secured an unprecedented investment from all sources, including support for the natural wonders on which the whole world depends, and accelerated the economic shifts that are already underway to make sure every penny across our economies takes us closer to our nature goals in the way that we are already beginning to do for climate. We built on that under Egypt's presidency of COP27, and we're already working with the United Arab Emirates for COP28. And our negotiators are working here tirelessly in a collective effort to find common ground so we achieve meaningful outcomes and targets on everything from protecting nature and making sure everyone feels the benefits of using it sustainably to transparency and accountability. We must agree a strong, ambitious framework for action to make this the decade we put the natural world on a road to recovery. We want everyone to endorse the 10-point plan for financing biodiversity that we have been working on alongside Ecuador, Gabon and the Maldives. So we give developed and developing countries spanning 5 continents the confidence they need to sign up to an agreement. Friends, this moment is our best chance yet to hardwire nature into our lives and our economies. It is up to us, right here, right now, to make sure failure is firmly off the table and come together to secure the agreement. And if we continue to work together to implement it, then we stand not only to avoid the worst impacts, but to secure the future of life on Earth and improve the lives of people everywhere for generations to come. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary of State for her statement, and I'll give the floor to His Excellency the Honourable Poto Williams, Minister of Conservation of New Zealand.
Mr. President, Your Excellency Minister Stephen Guilbeault, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is unceded Indigenous lands, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The world is gathering here now. We are at a defining moment for our planet. Biodiversity is being lost faster than at any other period in our human history. Aotearoa New Zealand is an island nation in the Pacific, with an estimated 80,000 native species that have evolved in isolation over 80 million years. It is one of the richest and most threatened reservoirs of life on Earth. 75% of extinctions in the last few hundred years have been on islands. Our region is dominated by small islands heavily reliant on their natural environments. For us, the need for urgent action to address the dual crises of climate change and biodiversity loss is clear. At COP-27 last month, our nations recognised the inextricable link between climate change and biodiversity loss and the vital importance of protecting, conserving and restoring nature and ecosystems. New Zealand is committed to responding to climate crisis in a way that also protects, enhances and restores nature, and we have integrated nature-based solutions into our policy frameworks. Colleagues, COP-15 must be the turning point for nature. We need to agree an ambitious global framework to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. But getting the framework right is just the first step. How each of us then champions and implements the new framework will determine its success. We cannot ignore our collective failure to achieve the Aichi goals. The new targets must be stronger and smarter in a framework that addresses all the major drivers of biodiversity loss. Monitoring and reporting on our progress will be crucial in driving action and holding all of us to account. So will transitioning financial systems and our economies towards nature-positive outcomes. We also acknowledge that there is a global nature finance gap. New Zealand is committed to working with others to increase funding for biodiversity and to eliminate environmentally damaging subsidies. We have significantly increased our contribution to the Global Environment Facility's replenishment this year. Our new international climate finance strategy prioritises investing in climate action that benefits biodiversity, oceans and nature. New Zealand stands ready to work with all of you to agree a transformational post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We must ensure that ecosystems and Indigenous species thrive, people are enriched by their connection with nature, prosperity and thriving biodiversity are linked, and the integral role of Indigenous peoples' leadership is recognised. I leave you with this thought. Toitu te marae a tāne, toitu te marae a Tangaroa, toitu te tangata. If the land is well and the sea is well, the people will thrive. Thank you. Nō reira tēnā koutou, a tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Madam Minister, thank you very much for your statement. I now give the floor to Monaco, to Her Excellency Silang Karhong Dajiani, Minister of Public Works, Environment and Urban Development, following which I'll give the floor to Belgium. Madam Minister, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the People's Republic of China, Canada, the Government of Quebec, and of course the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity for organizing, in difficult conditions, this COP-15, the stakes of which we are all aware of. Science, through the report of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is alerting us to a large number of animal and plant species that are threatened with extinction, and we must all listen and act. So we are at a crossroads with insufficient progress in the implementation of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. We can't fail to commit ourselves to an ambitious and proactive post-2020 global framework in order to arrest the loss of biodiversity so it doesn't become irreversible. Under the direction of His Highness Prince Albert II, the national strategy for the biodiversity of the Principality of Monaco is firmly in line with the objectives of the work programme for the conservation, protection, restoration and sustainable management of biodiversity and ecosystems. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Monaco, 98% of which is urbanized and open to sea, is also a reservoir of biodiversity at the center, one of the 10 regional biodiversity hotspots in the Mediterranean. In this context, the government of Monaco is committed to strengthening the role of nature in the territorial reconciling urban planning and nature by rethinking the Principality's urban planning through the integration of ecosystem services in development policies. This desire is reflected in the implementation of renaturation of the city based on solutions that should also enable the territory to adapt to climate change. Well, the Principality, aware that the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis are interconnected, places the protection of nature in the center. Monaco was quickly joined the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. We call on all governments that haven't done so to commit to conserving and effectively managing at least 30% of our planet and oceans by 2030. It's also about restoring and conserving biodiversity, taking a crucial step to help mitigate future pandemics and health emergencies, and to lay the foundation for a sustainable global economy through job creation and human well-being. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our responsibility is enormous and our duty is clear: to put in place an ambitious framework until 2030 to live in harmony with nature and keeping this spirit here for the benefit of humanity. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister, for your statement. I now invite the following speaker to take the floor. That's the Minister of Climate, Environment, Sustainable Development and Green Deal, Madam Zakia Khatibi of Belgium. Following that, I will give the floor to Hungary. I now give the floor to Belgium.
I thank you, Mr. President, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Every day, we are more and more confronted with the devastating effects of biodiversity loss, of climate change, of pollution and ecosystem disruption. These interlinked global crises require common solutions. In order to achieve the SDGs in the next 7 years, we need to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. As a member of the European Union, Belgium is fully committed to the negotiations for an ambitious and transformative agreement on biodiversity. As a blue leader and member of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, and the Global Ocean Alliance, Belgium strongly supports the 30 by 30 target to protect 30% of the land and 30% of the oceans. If we really want to achieve our 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, we must also ensure the sustainable management of the remaining 70% of our beautiful blue planet. Every square meter counts. In our country, we must also take our responsibility. To achieve this, Belgium is convinced of the need to integrate biodiversity into all our policies and sectors. We will break down the silos to build a truly national biodiversity strategy. This integration is also crucial with regard to funding. If we want to close the $700 billion nature restoration gap, after all, $500 billion can already be covered by redirecting existing harmful subsidies. The remaining $200 billion gap must come from financial resources from all sources. The multilateral development banks and the private sector also have a key role to play, and Belgium is ready to support its partners around the world to achieve this ambition together. For example, during the last replenishment cycle of the Global Environment Facility, we significantly increased our contribution from $75.29 million to $107.4 million, and will also continue to support countries through multilateral and bilateral cooperation, such as our support to Biofin. Belgium is reaching out to all of you to become true partners in bridging the giant gap and living in harmony with nature. And as the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, asked us, we must make a peace treaty with nature. We have only one world, one health, so let's preserve it together. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. I now give the floor to Hungarian Dr. Ichka Nagy, following which will be the floor given to Cyprus.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to represent my country at this important level event. First of all, I'd like to express my appreciation to the government of the People's Republic of China for organizing the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the related high-level meeting, as well as our host, the Government of Canada, for providing the opportunity to hold a meeting at the seat of the Convention. Our task is to make this conference historic by adopting a global biodiversity framework that is sufficiently ambitious and transformative, at the same time realistic. This is essential in order to stop and reverse the unprecedented decline of the Earth's biological diversity. Allow me to illustrate through 3 examples the measures and commitments Hungary will rely on to help implement the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. First, on the one hand, Hungary's new agricultural support system will enter into force in January 2023, and many of its elements are a good example of how to help the sectoral integration of biodiversity conservation and the reform of incentive measures and subsidies within the agricultural sector in parallel. This nationwide measure can have a great impact on biological diversity, since more than 50% of the territory of our country is under agricultural cultivation. The new agricultural support system, which will come into force next year, has stricter requirements for farmers, many of which will benefit biodiversity. The agricultural support system has also been expanded with an incentive support program operating on a voluntary basis. Within this scheme, farmers receive financial support for measures aimed at preserving biodiversity, increasing the diversity of landscape with mosaic features, improving the conditions of soil, water balance, preserving pollinators, and supporting the more sustainable use of pesticides. It is also a significant step forward that, breaking with several decades of ban, biodiversity-rich landscape features within agricultural fields not used for production, but of particular importance from the point of view of biodiversity conservation, can now also receive subsidies. We expect from this measure to increase the number of critically important riparian and wetland habitats. As a second example, let me mention that in the past decade, Hungary implemented an unprecedented volume of nature conservation investments, targeting the protection of biodiversity and natural values. In the framework of these, we have improved the status of habitats in about 15%, more than 300,000 hectares of our protected areas, which make up for more than a fifth of the country's territory, and ensure the infrastructural conditions for nature conservation management. The amount we spent on these developments exceeded 300 million euros. Our plan is to implement new nature conservation investments on at least 100,000 hectares over the next 5 years. The overall allocation supporting our plans is about 112 million euros. More than 70% of these funds will support nature restoration and the development of the infrastructure that ensures nature conservation management. The remaining part will be planned for projects aimed at the development of nature conservation, presentation, education, monitoring, as well as the renewal of our nature conservation information system. Finally, I'm pleased to announce that Hungary's new National Biodiversity Strategy until 2030 has been prepared in parallel with the negotiations of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is about to be adopted by the government shortly after COP-15. Distinguished Chair, ladies and gentlemen, let me finally say that we trust in everybody's constructive cooperation for the successful conclusion of COP-15, as well as the adoption and subsequent implementation of the post-2020 GBF. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Nagy, for your statement. I now give the floor to Cyprus to give the floor to Dr. Kotas Kadis, Minister of Agriculture, Rural Development and Environment. Following that, I will invite Austria to take the floor. Now I give the floor to Cyprus. You have the floor, Minister.
Distinguished delegates, I am honored to represent the Republic of Cyprus at the 2022 United Nations Biodiversity Conference, a conference that is convened in the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic, in a world suffering from conflicts, struggling with inequity, and facing climate, biodiversity, and pollution crisis. Even though the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted our dependence on nature, the rate of biodiversity loss still remains high. The adoption and successful implementation of a bold post-2020 global biodiversity framework is therefore crucial in preventing, halting, and reversing the degradation of ecosystems and biodiversity loss. Excellencies, Cyprus, a small country blessed with rich biodiversity, has developed and has been implementing a national biodiversity strategy covering the period of 2020 to 2030. Through the implementation of our strategy, we can push towards our common global goals. As of this year, Cyprus has more than 30% of its terrestrial area under protection, and we are striving to contribute to the ambitious goals set by the European Union and all its member states for at least 30% of land and sea under protection and 10% of land and sea under strict protection. We are also working towards restoring damaged ecosystems and improving conservation status of our species. Our goal is to mainstream biodiversity issues as to achieve an integrated approach to solutions. Even the smallest nation can make a difference. So I would like to invite you all to step up the efforts and make a difference It is crucial to adopt an ambitious and achievable post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and political commitment is a key at this point. We need to mobilize resources, including private ones, to promote capacity building and digital sequencing initiatives, utilizing indigenous knowledge and share its benefits. Ladies and gentlemen, ecological civilization should not become just another target that we do not meet. It should be a way of life that we should build on at a global level. It is our duty and obligation to put biodiversity on a path to recovery. And however challenging this may seem, it is the only way forward. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister, for your statement. I now invite Austria to take the floor. I give the floor to Minister of Climate Action, Environment, Energy, Mobility, Innovation and Technology, Madam Leonore Grisula, following whom I will invite Zambia to take the floor. Austria, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, today we are facing multiple historic turning points. The crises we are in reveal our world's vulnerabilities and inequities. Never before have we experienced how important nature is for our well-being, for our health and economies. Biodiversity is also our strong ally in the fight against climate change. We will never be able to win this fight without a healthy and intact nature. Austria, as a member of the European Union, is strongly committed to an ambitious and transformative post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which must be based on 3 pillars. The GBF must include strong and measurable targets that effectively address the main drivers of biodiversity loss. It must ensure conservation of biodiversity by establishing 30% protected areas on both land and ocean. And the GBF must ensure the mainstreaming of biodiversity into all sectors of society and the economy. Therefore, it needs strong commitments from all parties to set immediate steps to implement the new global framework. I'm very happy to be able to report to you today that recently Austria finalized our new Austrian Biodiversity Strategy 2030. Our strategy in particular is strongly committed to protecting 30% of national territory and a significant increase in strictly protected areas. Excellencies, Austria fully remains committed to supporting the implementation of the new global biodiversity framework both nationally and globally. And as many of us have said, we need to tap all sources for providing the necessary means of implementation, private and public, domestic and international. Austria will contribute to this, to the protection of biodiversity worldwide, including through doubling biodiversity financing and ensuring the consideration of biodiversity in all our bi- and multilateral ODA financing. Ladies and gentlemen, biodiversity is the very basis and foundation of the functioning of this planet. It is the key precondition for our life and for the development of humanity. At the moment, it seems we're doing everything we can to shake this very foundation, to shatter it even. This cannot be our path. Let's not lay back and wait for the situation and our people to get desperate. Let's not wait for others to push us. Let's show instead that we all can be proactive and courageous leaders who do what's necessary to keep this planet healthy for us and for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Zambia. I invite His Excellency Honorable Elijah Julaki Machina to take the floor. Following that, I give the floor to Japan. You have the floor, Zambia.
Your Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great honor and privilege to speak to you on behalf of the Honorable Minister of Lands and Natural Resources of Zambia, Honorable Elijah Muchima. I would like to start by thanking the People's Republic of China for the invitation and support extended to my country to attend this high-level segment of COP-15. Chairperson, Zambia supports all efforts aimed at facilitating the adoption of an ambitious, well-balanced, and practical post-2020 global biodiversity framework. With regard to protected areas, I wish to state that Zambia supports the ambitious protected area target of 30%. However, the target should not be conditional at country level, as it should be a global target to be implemented according to each country's capabilities. Chairperson, what is important is for Africa and specifically Zambia to be supported to strengthen management effectiveness of protected areas, financial resources, and technology, to recognize the rights and roles of local communities in the implementation of this target, among other issues. With regard to resource mobilization, my country supports the idea of calling for the establishment of a dedicated global biodiversity fund and for developed countries to provide additional funds to developing countries through bilateral and multilateral means in order to close the 700 billion global biodiversity funding gap. COP-15 should also adopt, alongside the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, a strategy for resource mobilization. Zambia, Chairperson, also supports the proposal for all parties to provide a 1% GDP towards biodiversity conservation. However, the feasibility of the 1% GDP should first be assessed, especially in least developing countries. With regard to synergies, Chairperson, Zambia recognizes that climate change, desertification, and land degradation are serious threats to biodiversity, and therefore commits to take the measures necessary to strengthen biodiversity resilience to climate change, desertification, and land degradation through ecosystem-based approaches for nature-based solutions. And with regard to capacity building, scientific cooperation, and technology transfer, Zambia acknowledges that special provision is required to meet the needs of developing countries, including the provision of appropriate access to relevant technologies, and therefore, Chairperson, reaffirms that capacity building, scientific cooperation, and technology transfer are necessary to achieve the goals of the Convention and facilitate the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. With regard to integration of biodiversity in economic development sectors, Chairperson, Zambia emphasizes the importance of early support towards developing countries to integrate biodiversity and the framework into economic development sectors for the mobilization of financial resources and the implementation of activities for the restoration, protection, and conservation of biological diversity. Lastly, Chairperson, with regard to access and benefit sharing, Zambia is of the view that there should be an urgent international solution to address benefit sharing from utilization of digital sequence information derived from genetic resources. In this regard, Zambia calls for capacity building in regulating and promoting benefit sharing from the utilization of tangible genetic resources and DSI. I thank you most sincerely, Chairperson, Ministers, and Excellencies, for listening to our speech. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I once again appeal to all speakers to limit your statements to 3 minutes. I thank you for your cooperation. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Akihiro Nishimura, Minister of the Environment of Japan, to be followed by Costa Rica. I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the COP President, Minister Huang, the co-chairs, all the parties, and the Secretariat for their dedicated efforts to this date. Mr. President, as the COP-10 presidency, Japan has led the implementation of the Aichi biodiversity targets, including through the JBF, Japan Biodiversity Fund. We must adopt a new framework, including ambitious targets such as 30 by 30, and a robust review mechanism with appropriate resources mobilization towards the 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature. Mr. President, Japan is already looking into the implementation phase. I will declare the launch of the second phase of the JBF during this segment, and together with many partners, present a concrete plan of action. Along with that, we will continue working further on the Satoyama initiative that promotes the conservation and sustainable use of local natural resources. These efforts should accelerate the implementation of the new framework, which will also be useful for climate actions through nature-based solutions. In addition, Japan has pledged $638 million to the JEF8. Now, furthermore, Japan will pledge 117 billion yen for biodiversity over 2023 to 2025. Regarding DSI, should any mechanism be established, full consideration of parties' domestic feasibility under its legal system is the key factor. Ensuring open science is also vital when we remind its worldwide benefit during COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to urge all parties to sincerely listen to all parties and stakeholders' voices on these issues. Japan will work with all to bring success to COP-15. Thank you.
I thank you, Minister of the Environment of Japan, for your statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Franz Tattenbach Capra, Minister of Environment and Energy of Costa Rica, to be followed by Uruguay. Dear Minister, you have the floor.
Popular de China.
Your Excellency, President of the COP, we would like to thank the Government of China as well as the Government of Canada for welcoming us, as well as Ms. Arumo, the Executive Secretary of the Convention, as well as Francis Agual, Basil Van Haam for the work being done at this COP. Ladies and gentlemen, ministers and delegates, as a world leader in negotiations underway at this convention, we are committed to adopting an ambitious framework on biodiversity. given the triple crisis giving rise to the loss of biodiversity, that is climate change, desertification, it is important to commit to and implement the framework so that humanity can live in harmony with nature. Now, with regard to human rights and biodiversity and democracy, we believe in promoting peace and the environment. These are the pillars upholding our country. And with France and the United Kingdom, we are proud to co-chair the Coalition for High Ambition for Nature, Hack for Nature and People. And we're jointly, more than 116 countries are committed to preserve 30% of the lands and oceans of the world by 2030. This is a minimum standard that scientists have stated to be necessary to stop the loss of biodiversity. Costa Rica has more than 25% of protected land areas and more than 50% of forestry coverage. And we also are protecting the seas that compose 92% of the Costa Rican area. And we have exceeded our goals. And we continue to be committed to protecting nature in Costa Rica. And we support also gender equity so that the benefits be shared fairly and Indigenous women and girls be taken into account. And of course, taking into account Indigenous knowledge. So the developing countries require financial assistance and cooperation. We have to strengthen the GEF as Costa Rica has a great deal of experience in implementing environmental protections and the enhancement of biodiversity. And that is why we are focusing our policies on implementation. And along with United Kingdom, France, during the high-level segment in New York, we entered into the second stage of HAC. And this will lend support to countries to help countries achieve Target 3, which we hope to approve. This is the only way to address sustainable development around the world. We are assured that this COP will mark a historic moment. Thank you very much.
I thank Minister, Your Excellency, for your statement. Now I'll give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Adrián Peña Robena, Minister of Environment of Uruguay, to be followed by Cambodia. Minister, you have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. We would like to begin this statement by thanking the governments of China and Canada for organizing COP-15. Uruguay is in a transition period and has a great deal of biodiversity, but most importantly, it has much natural pasture land, one of the largest areas of this type of ecosystem in the world. And one of its characteristics is that it's located nearby some of the most important protected marine areas. Our country produces food, and this is the basis of our economy. Our big challenge is conservation and tying that in with production while ensuring quality of life and sustainable development. We would like to be a country that increases production, but respecting commitments to the environments. We want to conserve nature, and we do a great deal of cattle farming. And in Uruguay, every cow Macau is a steward of an area of biodiversity. So to improve environments in this particular area, we have made progress in cattle farming, and we will be making a presentation this Saturday at a special event. And we have a responsibility for food security in the planet and a clear commitment to conservation. And we are committed to adopting an ambitious post-2020 framework. And we will continue to work in our country in keeping and in synergy with all of the conventions. And we join in with other countries who support an ambitious global framework. We want to achieve this target. We are completely committed to developing legal instruments on plastics. And with regard to the Nagoya Protocol, Uruguay has developed a participatory process for benefit sharing for all stakeholders. And along these lines, we think it is important to have the implementation of a system that guarantees the fair sharing of benefits, as well as a solid DCI instrument. Now, to achieve effective implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we need special conditions for helping developing countries. We need to have predictable, measurable, new and additional financial assistance for developing countries. This is a determining factor. The level of ambition of target has to be tied in with effective mobilization of resources. We have come to COP-15 to cooperate with all the other parties to arrive at an ambitious framework that will enable us to make the necessary changes to live in harmony with nature. Uruguay defends these multilateral ambitions, but this requires decisions that we can no longer wait for, because we have to take action, and the time is now. Thank you.
I thank you, Minister, for your statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sai Samao, Minister of Environment of Cambodia, to be followed by Slovenia. Minister, you have the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Cambodia is highly appreciated the People's Republic of China and Canada for making this long-awaited gathering possible. As a country rising from the ash of war, Cambodia is a unique success story. Peace, political and economic stability in the last 20 years has transformed Cambodia into a middle-class society. And this has created unprecedented opportunity for us to join global effort in addressing climate change and preserving the remaining biodiversity. Cambodia was the second LDC and the first in ASEAN to submit long-term strategy for carbon neutrality with a 2050 target. We have adopted Nagoya Protocol and update our NDC. We are investing in resilient infrastructure, turning our city into a livable city, ensuring access to basic and affordable services and education, affordable housing, and food security. These public investment allowed Cambodia to expand the size of her biodiversity sanctuaries and ensure their protections, which cover about 40% of our territories, exceeding the achieved biodiversity target of 17%, and providing sanctuary to about 2% of threatened species on IUCN Red List. COVID-19 and geopolitical tension have wreaked havoc in the world, but we must not lose our sight. Cambodia believes that the price of carbon credits should be higher, green finance should be enhanced, loss and damage should be considered, and sovereign debt should be addressed when we talk about preserving the remaining biodiversity. Cambodia, as the 2022 ASEAN Chair, has initiated the ASEAN Green Deal and strongly support the global biodiversity frameworks. As ASEAN, we collectively reiterate the need for realistic yet ambitious and transformative post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We encourage parties to build on the Bern process and to deepen global cooperation to address interrelated challenges and minimize devastating consequences of biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradations, and climate change. Thank you.
I thank Minister for your statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Uroš Brezan, Minister of the Environment and Spatial Planning of Slovenia, to be followed by Argentina. Minister, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues and friends, allow me first to express my gratitude to Government of the People's Republic of China as Presidency for the dedicated work to ensure successful COP-15 and to Canada for all their efforts and great hospitality. This conference must be a big milestone for biodiversity. We have a heavy responsibility to adopt the ambitious and transformative post-2020 global biodiversity framework that we urgently need to overcome the biodiversity crisis. Slovenia reaffirms its commitment to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and contribute to the achievement of global goals and targets. Slovenia is a green country, loved for its nature and related services by its inhabitants and visitors. I'm proud that our country succeeded in protecting 40% of our territory. We are ensuring closer to nature management of our forests, covering more than 60% of total area of our country. We are also striving for more biodiversity-friendly agriculture, including efforts to protect pollinators. Slovenia is increasingly using nature-based solutions in water management and other key sectors. Even so, a lot of challenges remain, particularly in mobilizing enough resources and in enhancing human capacities and improving knowledge. We must offer each other greater support going forward, especially in our endeavors to close the global financial gap. In Slovenia, we will continue in enhancing our efforts on the local, national, and regional levels. As Minister of the Environment, I will strive to achieve a whole-of-government approach that must lead us to achieve national objectives and become a stronger partner internationally. Dear colleagues, although there are many differences among us and challenges ahead, it is crucial that we share a common vision to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. We must reach a positive agreement for transformative post-2020 global biodiversity framework that will guide us in stepping up our actions for a nature-positive world and cleaner, healthier, and sustainable environment. Thank you.
I thank you, Minister, for your statement, and I now give the floor to Mr. Juan Hernandez, the Minister of Argentina. Minister, you have the floor.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and congratulations to China as well as the Government of Canada for organizing COP-15. Our planet is suffering an unprecedented environmental crisis, and we have to be clear in defining the causes. If we want to achieve the targets, and most especially define the financing for the solutions. The environmental crisis wrought by humanity is historical, and the level of consumerism at this point is unsustainable. We cannot demand to the many, many millions living in poverty the same as the 1% of the world population. The elites of this world need to be seated at the table, not as philanthropists, but as those who are responsible for the situation, and they need to be committed to making changes to the methods of production. You can't just have the peripheral countries take equal responsibility for the environmental deterioration. These countries in a post-industrial period have destroyed the environment and usurped the biodiversity of many countries, then made changes to the soils of our countries, and all of this to satisfy its interests and at the same time demanding of us greater ambitions. We need to have to talk about overly developed countries and not just about developing countries. We do understand that all of this discourse will serve absolutely no purpose unless the wealthy countries contribute a greater percentage. So we have, if the majority of the millions of the populations of this world were to consume what the most developing countries are consuming, the situation would be much worse. So we talk about conserving biodiversity, but we can only do this by talking also about means of production. And we have to go back to a principle of the original Rio agreements. Argentina is the 8th largest country of the world and has a large amount of its country protected. We've done more than what many other countries have done, and we've conserved 30% of marine areas. And we want to protect the land areas, and we're more than France and Italy or the Netherlands. We would like to see the reciprocity from the central countries, because the developing countries need to help us finance the achievement of targets. So we need to see many, many millions of dollars to be able to continue the conservation work in ours. And we are the green heart of the planet. So we need to recognize the ecological services that we have that are helping the developed countries. So this COP could be a turning point to prevent further loss of biodiversity. We need to see innovative measures to deal with climate change and to help those countries who are dealing with debt issues and the payment of their debt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Your Excellency, I thank you for your statement, and I now give the floor to the Minister of Environment, Nature Protection and Sustainable Development, His Excellency Mr. Pierre Heller of Cameroon. After that, it will be St. Lucia. You have the floor, Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for me this is a privilege and an honor to take the floor on occasion of this high-level segment within the framework of the second part of COP-15. Through me, the government of Cameroon would like to express its gratitude to the People's Republic of China and to Canada for the warm welcome. We are facing great stakes. What is at stake is to develop a global framework to guide us in trying to reverse biodiversity loss and to attain the goals of the Convention, as well as within the program until 2050. In terms of conservation, Mr. President, Cameroon has created protected areas to the tune of 2% of its national territory. which is higher than the relevant Aichi target. My country welcomes global efforts to mainstream conservation of biodiversity with national policies. Cameroon, while acting in the spirit of global synergy in protecting global ecosystems, is committed to the 30% target, 30 by 30 target. Capacity building and development and scientific cooperation are the leading preconditions for the efficient implementation of this framework. With regard to the Nagoya Protocol, my country supports the efforts in digital sequencing for this data to be integrated with our national biodiversity programs. With regard to the mobilization of resources, I'm inviting you to bear in mind that if we want to preserve our future, we need to invest today. The results of the implementation of Aichi targets has shown the insufficiency of these efforts and requires more sacrifices in terms of financing and for the adequate financing of the global framework. With this in mind, Cameroon would like to call on other countries to provide the necessary financing for protecting biodiversity in compliance with Article 21 of the Convention. Mr. President, Cameroon commits itself to revise its nationally defined contribution to be better in line with the global framework and the national strategy up to the year 2030. First of all, we need to strengthen the coordination mechanisms and to improve communication among stakeholders. Secondly, we need to step up the process of developing our new commitments of non-state actors initiated in the framework of the 2030 project. Thirdly, we need to strengthen synergy between sectors and other actors in biodiversity. Mr. President, such is the position of Cameroon, that future belongs to us. It depends on what we are going to decide collectively at this COP-15. We must make the right choices in order to redress the current negative trends. I thank you.
I thank you, Minister, for your intervention. And I'll now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Alfred Prosper, Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries, Food Security and Rural Development of St. Lucia. After St. Lucia will be North Macedonia. The Minister of St. Lucia, you have the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished colleague ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we gather here today with the opportunity to change how biodiversity loss is addressed. I urge parties to consider the proposals before us and, where possible, seek compromise in order to reach consensus. Biodiversity loss affects us all, and if we are to put biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030, we must act with urgency and commit to implementing the global biodiversity framework at all levels. Distinguished delegates, we can no longer delay much needed ambitious action. Over the last 5 years, a number of countries experienced Category 5 hurricanes with extensive flooding. The world continues to face unprecedented challenges in the form of biodiversity loss and pollution. The triple planetary crisis is touching all shores. We cannot afford to live here without adopting a GBF that will be environmentally, socially, and economically beneficial as we strive to realize the 2050 global vision. Urgent and decisive action is required if we are to achieve the vision of living in harmony with nature. St. Lucia, as a seeds, has suffered from the impacts of this planetary crisis, and as a response, we are committed to implementing actions that will lessen these impacts on our nation. Currently, St. Lucia is in the process of updating and implementing new legislation to address biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. These improvements in our legislative framework put our island in a position to implement the GBF and other multilateral environmental agreements to which we are party. St. Lucia will update its National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan to align it with the GBS goals and targets to improve conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. A resilient ecosystem adaptation strategy and action plan was developed because we recognize the important role our ecosystems play in the well-being of our people and country. St. Lucia is proud to be recognized under the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration flagship initiative. We take this recognition seriously and remain grateful for this opportunity to continue integrating marine and coastal ecosystem restoration and conservation. Just as important, successful operationalization and implementation of this ambitious GBF will require our collective action so that biodiversity hotspot nations like ourselves will have the necessary financial, technological, and capacity building resources to enable the achievement of the GBF. I thank you.
I thank Your Excellency for your statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Nasser Noureddini, Minister of Environment and Physical Planning of Republic of North Macedonia. After that will be in Moldova. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear ministers, dear colleagues, dear participants, a healthy biodiversity is fundamental both to the planet and to the people, and we need it now more than ever. Healthy ecosystems provide a range of goods and services to the people, ensuring food and water security for many, sustaining our livelihoods and our economic growth, and helping mitigate one of our key challenges, climate change. Habitat loss and fragmentation, unsustainable agriculture, and consumption patterns, all coupled by climate change, are the leading drivers of biodiversity loss in the world. Although a small country, the Republic of North Macedonia hosts a significant share of biodiversity. It contains more than 70% of all the plant species found in the Balkan Peninsula, making it a major repository of plant diversity in Europe. We're proud to report that we have increased the protected area in our country by over extra 5% over the past period, in parallel to undertaking significant efforts to improve the management effectiveness and financial sustainability. The newly proclaimed National Park Shar is one of the most important transboundary sites in the region, and together with the protected areas in the Republic of Kosovo and the Republic of Albania, we've created one of the largest protected areas in Europe, which covers over 242,000 hectares. The discussions we're leading here today might be ambitious, but they're achievable. Targets to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and reinforce climate action and build sustainable cities and food systems, strengthen public planning and redirect financial flow to support it all. Nature holds answers to many of the world's most pressing challenges, including achieving conservation outcomes, climate targets, while maintaining economic objectives. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework must highlight the value of equitable and rights-based, nature-based solutions as a new development paradigm, and business and investors must be seen as allies and not as enemies. We recognize that this might be a global goal. However, regional cooperation is a key element in succeeding when it comes to achieving these targets. Therefore, in the face of accelerating the biodiversity loss, the world urgently needs a shared global goal for nature capable of driving action across governments, business, and societies, and to include all the people and the civil societies. Therefore, we need to learn to live in harmony with nature, and we need to do it now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your statement. I now invite Republic of Moldova to take the floor. I give the floor to Yardanka Rodica, Minister of Environment, to take the floor, following which I will give the floor to Federated States of Micronesia. Minister, you have the floor. Microphone to Republic of Moldova, please.
Okay. So we move to Micronesia. Well,
没有是吧？那好，那我们。
Well, in that case, I give the floor to Federated States of Micronesia. I give the floor to Madam Elena Akinaga, Secretary of Department of Resources of Development, to be followed by Haiti. Madam Elena Akina, you have the floor.
Excellencies, Honorable COP President, distinguished delegates, I would like to thank the People's Republic of China for your leadership in the preparations for and conducting of COP-15 as the host. I also thank the Government of Canada and its people for your generous hospitality here in Montreal, as well as the Secretariat of the UNCBD for your unfaltering support. Your tireless efforts lay the foundation for outcomes of this meeting that can save the world's biodiversity and assure human well-being. Excellencies, we have reached the pivotal point in history. It is estimated that 77% of land and 87% of the ocean have been transformed by human activity. As a result of our actions, estimates indicate a loss of over 80% of wild mammal biomass and roughly half the planet's plant biomass. At this current rate, science suggests that more than 1 million plant and animal species are on the cusp of extinction, placing us on a trajectory towards the sixth mass extinction. These astounding numbers have tremendous implications on global environmental health, the future status of biodiversity, and ultimately nature's provisioning capacity, not to mention the well-being of people who depend on nature for its many services and functions. Micronesia, like the rest of the small island developing states in the Pacific region, is uniquely challenged due to our limited land, our geographic location, and the enormity of our ocean areas. As such, it is of utmost importance to Micronesia that the Global Biodiversity Framework takes into consideration the needs and special circumstances of small islands developing states like Micronesia and contributes to conserving our unique biodiversity, including through the provision of adequate, predictable, new and additional finance and other means of implementation. Today, it is estimated that the global human population has surpassed the 8 billion mark. Yet after 10 years of steady decline in world hunger, hunger is now on the rise, affecting roughly 10% of people worldwide. Against this backdrop, it is also estimated that by 2050, we could lose roughly 90% of the world's coral reefs. Mass coral extinction has detrimental consequences for islands and coastal communities, as roughly 1 billion people worldwide depend on coral reefs not only for their livelihoods, but for their food security. Excellencies and colleagues, the loss of corals and a decline of overall ocean health would cost the world roughly $9.9 trillion globally. Therefore, healthy ocean biodiversity should not be a Pacific Island national and regional priority, but it must also be a global priority too. The expanse of Micronesia's maritime zones represents both an opportunity and at the same time an enormous challenge. We have some of the largest fishing grounds in the Pacific, covering an area of 1.1 million square miles, and one of the most productive tuna fisheries in the Western and Central Pacific. Like most of the Pacific Islands, we need investments in capacity to manage and monitor the health of our biodiversity and the impacts of human activities that affect the status of our biodiversities. Excellencies, admittedly, I come before you all today with deep concern. After 14 CBD COPs, literally 30 years later, the world is threatened with the potential of widespread biodiversity collapse. We cannot ignore the consequences of our actions, nor can we continue to argue over semantics. We live in a mutually dependent world with a common desire for global sustainability through biodiversity conservation. Cooperation and partnership are key to ensuring that current and future generations of humankind are resilient and enjoy equitable socioeconomic health. Toward this end, Excellencies and colleagues, I urge us to come together to find common ground and reach an agreement on an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister, for your statement. I was reminded the microphone is not working for the Republic of Moldova's delegate. I now give the floor to the Minister of Environment of Republic of Moldova, Her Excellency Ivan Donov. Following her, I'll give the floor to Haiti. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Okay. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today we met to finalize and adopt the ambitious and achievable post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Exactly today, we need to agree on how to behave so that our children do not have to face the consequences. Let's think. We all have unique stories about the nature of our countries, and we are proud of it. The first things we note when we visit other countries is their nature. What will be our children be proud of in 20, 50 years? We always look for solutions, benefits, and welfare in nature. Half of the global GDP depends on nature. After all, nature does not need to be persuaded to help us, but it's our duty to help it. It is obvious only a healthy ecosystem can help humans to survive and live. But we created a paradox. We got used to living in a wide comfort zone which destroys our survival area. So now it's time to stop, rethink, recharge, act, to look for solutions to ensure human progress without the regress of nature. Humans have already radically changed 3/4 of the Earth's surface. Unfortunately, today we are facing a new crisis, a crisis of humanity with one more war in the world, which adds more painful and irreversible consequences of nature, as destructions of the forest, wildlife, protected areas, air, soil, and water quality, and the enormous quantity of military technical waste. Environmental disasters destroy our lives and economies no matter of borders. That's why it is of the utmost importance to take mitigation and adaptation actions together, to mobilize sufficient capacity and resources, technology and knowledge, to mutual assistance to achieve common goals. It is necessary to go for sustainable agriculture and forestry, to halt species extinctions, tackle various drivers of biodiversity loss, and invest in and promote nature-based solutions. Moldova supports an ambitious European Union target to protect at least 30% of the land and oceans by 2030. Indeed, when I list Moldovan's priority, you will say that yours are the same: afforestation, restoration of degraded ecosystems, the extensions of protected area, minimization of the impact of climate change on biodiversity, and others. Moldova intends to increase the afforested territory of the country from 11% today to 15% by 2030, and this is only the starting point for the long-term ambitions that are to increase up to 20% of the territory. We believe that it is essential to develop financial instruments at the national level for a consistent financial mechanism to address biodiversity protection, as well as to ensure that the international financial flow is sufficient to implement measures to achieve biodiversity goals at the national, regional, and global levels, mainly addressing the specificity of the countries and regions to protect biodiversity and prevent and restore damage to ecosystem caused by war, climate change, and other environmental disasters. Moldova believes that the solution of digital sequencing information should not hinder the current open access regime and scientific research, nor establishing additional administrative procedure. All aspects of it should be considered together with the practical, economically feasible solutions to contribute to implementing Agenda 2030. And last but not least, we may differ in the scope of issues, targets, and capacity to deal with, but we are united in the same problem, and eventually we all are parts of this one picture of our globe, and each input matters. Let me stop here and remind you that we must be an example for future generations and to learn how to take the responsibility together. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister, for your statement. I now give the floor to Haiti. I give the floor to Mr. James Cadet, Minister of Environment of Haiti, to speak. While following him, I'll give the floor to the State of Palestine. Haiti, you have the floor.
Mesdames, Messieurs. Ladies and gentlemen, permit me on behalf of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Haiti, His Excellency Mr. Henry, to express my gratitude to the governments of China and Canada for the excellent organization of work of the parties to the Convention. Co-chair, IPBES, our Intergovernmental Science Panel, has sounded alarm in its latest evaluation. The world is facing a major environmental crisis with climate change and biodiversity loss, which is threatening the very survival of humanity. The three agreements, the natural environment is significantly degraded by human activities. Many species are threatened with extinction. That threat would sap all the economies of the world, would upset the fragile balance between ecosystems. So the whole planet is in danger. It is against this backdrop of crisis we are here in Montreal time has come to send a signal to the entire world, because the future of the planet depends on our decisions today, in order to reverse the loss of biodiversity, to preserve our ecosystems, and the future particularly for women and children. Haiti, despite its difficult conditions, is not losing hope. And so the government of Haiti warmly welcomes the new post-2020 global framework for the conservation of biodiversity. This ambitious framework needs adequate resources to be mobilized in order to facilitate implementation by 2050. At national level, the Haitian government has committed to build up its system of protected marine and land areas. The challenges are enormous, which is why Haiti supports the idea of setting up the Global Biodiversity Fund, which needs to be both flexible and highly mobilizable, depending on global biodiversity needs, to help with capacity building to developing countries through the implementation of training, organizing of training and the transfer of technologies. More than never, it is necessary to act to save the children and to save our future. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. I now give the floor to the State of Palestine. I invite the chairperson of the Environment Quality Authority, Madam Tamimi, to speak. Following her, I will give the floor to Belize. Madam Tamimi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Allow me at the outset to congratulate the governments of China and Canada and the Secretariat for the convening of this conference and the hospitality, wishing that our efforts will be successful and our decisions realistic towards achieving and realizing our aspirations. Mr. President, the progress achieved in the past decade was not sufficient to achieve the HE targets, and the interlinked crises and the main drivers behind the loss of biodiversity, whether in the changes of the use of lands, desertification, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species, LMOs, and other threats, all of which constitute a real threat to the health of humanity and food security. Ladies and gentlemen, the State of Palestine has ratified the 3 Rio Conventions, particularly that related to biodiversity, and prepared the National Spatial Plan for the protection of natural resources and the natural and cultural heritage that regulated the uses of land and protection of areas rich of biodiversity, reserves and forests. And we are currently updating the national network for natural reserves according to the criteria of the Convention, as well the IUCN criteria. Currently, we are in the last stages of updating our strategy and national plan for biodiversity for the year 2030 to be aligned with the post-2020 GBF. However, Israeli occupation practices on a daily basis on our lands, their practices in destroying our nature and the disposal and dumping of solid waste and hazardous waste, the theft of water and the uprooting of trees. More than 2.5 million trees since 1967 have been uprooted, including 800,000 olive trees. The depletion of the Dead Sea and the blockade imposed on Gaza Strip are all obstacles towards implementing the obligations according to the UN environmental conventions. What we are seeking to achieve in terms of the post-2020 GBF requires being realistic and political will. And for that reason, we need sufficient and equitable
financing for all parties, particularly developing countries, so that we reach to the year 2030 without any further extinction of species, and that the ecological system have been restored. Palestine, as all other countries, have the need to benefit from the international mechanism, whether in technical or financial aspects. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is watching us. Let our decisions be realistic, can be implemented, and I am confident that collective responsibility is the key factor for success. We need to work towards a future that is viable for our children and the future generations. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. Now I give the floor to Mr. Orlando Abet, Minister of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management of Belize, to be followed by the Russian Federation. Minister, the floor is yours.
Chairs, Excellencies, friends, colleagues, I bring you warm greetings from the proud people of Belize. On behalf of the delegation, I first would like to thank the Canadian government for its hospitality during our time in Montreal, and the government of China for their leadership in this CBD COP. Excellencies, in the past 50 years alone, global biodiversity has decreased by a staggering 69% as a result of our actions, with vertebrate species abundance falling at roughly 89% in the Caribbean and Latin American countries. Despite these facts, Belize has been doing its part to combat biodiversity loss. Today, Belize has 43.8% of its terrestrial land under protection, with over 7,000 species of flora and fauna. The struggle, however, has been in mobilizing the necessary resources to maintain and protect these areas from illegal extraction and build the resilience of these areas from the effects of climate change. Notwithstanding, much like the rest of the world, biodiversity loss has posed challenges for Belize with negative impacts on ecosystem functionality and species health. These challenges are further exacerbated by the impacts of climate change on our vulnerable, high biodiversity small island state. This is especially evident in Belize, which has over the past decade documented increases in forest fires, floodings, severe droughts, and more extreme hydrometeorological events. Storms like Hurricane Lisa, which on 2nd of November 2022 ravaged across our small nation, resulting in damages and losses of around 10% of Belize's national budget. Chair, with the impact of the convergence of these global challenges felt more now than before, the linkages between biodiversity loss and climate change are being increasingly recognized globally. Food production, which has been the cause for 70% of biodiversity loss on land, also accounts for 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. This is evidence that these issues are cross-cutting and that solutions to these problems require integrated and comprehensive approaches and commitments. To combat these challenges, Belize has also pioneered innovations which has allowed us to reconcile conservation and socio-economic needs and goals. These innovations and approaches span across the critical element which will enable the implementation of the ambitious biodiversity targets. We have expanded our protected areas with a key focus on connectivity, enacted legislation for the protection of mangroves, and enabled governance mechanisms and frameworks to strengthen management of our ecosystems with civil society. Belize's commitment to biodiversity and the targets under the CBD is further recognized with the establishment of a National Biodiversity Office to lead the way in safeguarding its biodiversity. As part of its long-term conservation commitment, though, the largest blue bond deal in the Americas, Belize has committed 30% of ocean protection by 2030, a target that will be met by 2026. This year's theme, Ecological Civilization, Building a Shared Future for All Life on Earth, is a vision also shared by the people of Belize. Our nation has indisputably pulled its weight to ensure that the CBD's goal of living in harmony with nature by 2050 is brought to fruition. Chair, Belize reaffirms its commitment to the global biodiversity framework and looks forward to a harmonized global approach to living in harmony with nature. Belize joins in the call that there is need to continue to rally attention for biodiversity, enlist individual and collective actions, and mobilize urgent financing, in particular for small island developing states. I thank you.
Thank
you, Excellency, for your statement. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Ruslan Edo-Giriev, Advisor to the President, Special Presidential Representative on Climate Issues, to be followed by the UAE. Sir, I'll give you the floor.
Бисмиллахир-рахманир-рахим. Уважаемый господин председатель.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome the participants of the high-level segment of COP-15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Mr. President, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to the People's Republic of China, which is co-chairing the session, despite all of the difficulties engendered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Your efforts are truly commendable. Our country has the largest biodiversity in northern Eurasia. It is both our pride and responsibility. Russia ascribes a great deal of significance to conserving biological diversity and ensuring its sustainable use. Among our priorities is setting up specially protected territories, the restoration and conservation of threatened species. More than 25% of our land is under legislative protection. 2020 saw the renewal of the Russian Red Book, including new species to protect them nationwide. More than 100 species, subspecies, and animal populations have been removed from the Red Book over the past few years. We have boosted the numbers of the Amur tiger, the forest leopard, the snow leopard, polar bears, bison, and ospreys. The numbers of the Amur tiger over the past 12 years has been doubled, and 25% of its habitat has been placed under special protection. We are also trying to promote environmental awareness among our businesses, which leads to the attraction of additional finance from non-budgetary sources to help with national strategies and action plans. I'd also like to stress the important role played by indigenous and small peoples. Their traditional experience and knowledge are particularly relevant at local and regional levels. Russia accounts for 1/5 of all forested land in the world, and so we have taken measures to step up our forest management, including combating forest fires and restoring forest ecosystems. We are convinced that COP-15 will become a major milestone in biodiversity conservation. The global framework for the post-2020 period is now being finalized. Russia ascribes key importance to that document. We are calling on parties to be flexible and constructive at this final stage of agreeing the text. The global framework program may become an ambitious and efficient instrument in line with the realities and challenges of our times, and play the same role for the biodiversity as the Paris Agreement for Climate. We are prepared to consider the global framework program as the basis for international cooperation along all fronts in conserving biodiversity. Place a clear and universal legal basis for this work. It's also important to take into account national priorities, the specifics of every state. In our view, it is particularly crucial to pay attention to the needs of developing countries, because they tend to have the greatest biodiversity and bring in the greatest contribution to its maintenance. We don't believe that it will be productive to impose too much of a financial burden on developing countries in the absence of any assistance. The financing of these mechanisms, including the Global Financial Global Environment Fund, are key to this success. In conclusion, I'd like to express my confidence that this Conference of the Parties will lay down conditions for our future work for decades to come, and what is most important, will step up constructive cooperation between all of the participating countries. I thank you.
Thank you for your statement, sir. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Mariam bint Mohammed Al Mahari, Minister of Climate Change and Environment of the UAE, to be followed by Bangladesh. You have the floor.
Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, on the outset, UAE would like to express thanks and appreciation to China as for chairing this conference, and Canada for hosting this COP-15 conference. The world is looking and watching, hoping for measures to be announced that will raise the ceiling of ambitions, which caused me to stress the importance of working on the post-2020 GBF and to have it adopted at the end of this conference. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, biodiversity has been at the center of our attention since the founding father, Sultan bin Nahyan, who had dedicated a large part of his life to protection of the environment so that future generations can enjoy sustainable environment. And these efforts were not limited to the local level or national level, but they extended to the regional and international levels. The founding father of our country has contributed to, in the 70s, in one of the most important programs to protect Bengal tigers by establishing 9 reserves for them in India. Today, there are more than 50 natural reserves for them around the world. His contribution of $50 million to planet Earth to strengthen the economic and social efforts and sustainable change in more than 100 countries have also made important, significant contributions. Biodiversity is part of our history and identity. Natural identity to that means we did a lot, and I will give you a very quick overview of the initiatives that were taken over the past 2 years. First, joining the declaration about Pledge to Nature and the Global Alliance for Oceans and the Global Initiative for Nature and People, as well as important and protected areas for biodiversity, and a strategy to limit the invasive alien species, and a red book for the species that are at the risk of extinction. And all of that has helped us stop and reverse the deterioration of biodiversity in our country. We also enacted a law regarding biosafety from LMOs and their products, and a law to also manage and fair sharing of benefits of genetic resources. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at a crossroad to stop and halt the loss of biodiversity. We have a very narrow window to work against climate change until 2030. And since we will be hosting the COP28 for climate change, we are reiterating that we will present a vision and global measures that would strengthen partnerships in global action and nature-based solutions. And we are one of the founding members, alongside with the US, that is called Aim4C. And we have announced, in collaboration with Indonesia during the COP27, the launching of the International Alliance, MAC. that aims at highlighting the importance of a certain kind of trees to limit and combat climate change. We would like to reiterate our commitment to work along with everyone to reverse the loss of biodiversity, to ensure its sustainability for our current and future generations, and look forward to welcoming you all at UAE next year during the COP-28. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for your statement. Now I give the floor to Mr. Shahab Udin, Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, to be followed by the Holy See. Minister, you have the floor.
His Excellency, Minister for Ecology and Environment of China and the President of COP-15, Executive Secretary of CBD. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of Government of Bangladesh, I express my sincere thanks to China as the presidency for COP-15, also to the Government of Canada and its citizens for hosting the meeting here in Montreal. Excellencies, the Constitution of Bangladesh recognizes the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem as one of the state's principles. We ratified CBD in 1994 and Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety in 2004. Very recent, Government of Bangladesh has decided to ratify Nagoya Protocol. Our national development plans and policies acknowledge the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem conservation, restoration to ensure food security. Bangladesh is one of the pioneer countries that enacted Bangladesh Biological Diversity Act in 2017 to address the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Besides Wildlife Conservation and Security Act 2012, which promulgated to scale up the conservation of wildlife, protected areas, and marine biodiversity. Moreover, Bangladesh National Adaptation Plan, NAP, Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy Action Plan, Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100, Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan integrate and recognize the conservation and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystem. Mr. President, Bangladesh is the 7th most climate vulnerable country to the adverse impact of climate change. As a small delta with a 165 million population, in addition, influx of 1.2 million Rohingya refugees, putting our biodiversity in critical situation. Government of Bangladesh, under the dynamic leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, is trying its best to make the country climate resilient. Bangladesh, being a biodiverse country, emphasizes the effective implementation of the ambitious global biodiversity framework (GBF) through resource mobilization, technology transfer, and capacity building. Excellency, with the rate of extension of species and degradation of ecosystem, financing to biodiversity conservation is not getting the momentum as the current sources of fund are not enough at all. Bangladesh highly emphasized the need for adequate resource mobilization. It is therefore urgent need to establish global biodiversity fund to enable vulnerable and developing countries to implement the convention under the Article 20 of the convention. Excellencies, now the world needs actions to implement post-2020 GBF with aiming a halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem and to achieve a nature-positive world by 2030. Bangladesh would like to reiterate to uphold the implementation of the Convention and its three objectives towards achieving the 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature. Bangladesh would undertake necessary steps to update NBSAP and contribute to achieve the goal of GBF. Thank you all.
I thank you, Your Excellency, for your statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ivan Djokovic as Apostolic Nuncio to Canada. Your Excellency, you have the floor. After that, it will be Estonia.
Is a critical junction, and its nature is declining globally at an unprecedented rate of human history. This conference has the opportunity to adopt an action-oriented and ambitious framework to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. In this regard, the Holy See would like to highlight the following points. First, the real drivers of biodiversity loss, including change in land use, deforestation, overexploitation and pollution, as well as plastic pollution and electronic waste, must be tackled in a coordinated and responsible manner through a whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach. Second, solutions to biodiversity loss should be framed within a paradigm that has a strong ethical foundation. Only an overreaching ethical framework that promotes global solidarity and strongly counters harmful incentives would ensure that people's needs are met in a sustainable way, especially for those in vulnerable situations. Third, while increasing to 30% protected areas is a step in the right direction, this is not enough if this is detrimental to indigenous peoples. Their relationship with land and resources is a fundamental expression of their identity. Indigenous peoples' rights, including free, prior, and informed consent, must be appropriately protected. Mr. President, the impoverishment of nature flowing from biodiversity loss exceeds the environmental dimension alone. It also represents a developmental, economic, security, social, and moral issue. The need to reverse course requires an ecological conversion that brings lasting change. Converting implies a change in its models of production, recalling the social and environmental responsibility of businesses and consumption, as well as in our lifestyle. Care for the environment, our common home, is in fact an universal duty that must be carried out bearing in mind the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Therefore, our common endeavor has to be grounded in the respect of inherent human dignity and directed at the promotion of integral human development. Such effort cannot be accomplished without restoring a harmonious relation with the nature. Let us all commit to working together to preserve the gift of creation for the future generations. Thank you.
I thank Your Excellency for your statement, and I now give the floor to the Minister of Environment of Estonia, His Excellency Mr. Madis Kallas. After that will be Chad. Your Excellency, I give you the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear delegates, colleagues, I would like to thank the government of the Republic of China and also Canada for hosting this high-level segment of CBD COP-15 here in Montreal. We are all here to adopt the global biodiversity framework and to agree on the need to increase our efforts for biodiversity. It is very sad that despite of ambitious targets set and agreements achieved, we have not been able to slow down the loss of biodiversity and degradation of ecosystems. Moreover, today we still witness a terrible, irreversible damage to the nature in Ukraine. We must tackle the destruction of nature and the global climate crisis together. Healthy ecosystems are just as important as a stable climate, and many nature-based solutions that work to save nature also help to save climate. Biodiversity protection and habitat restoration has for a long time been one of the Estonian environmental protection priorities. Today, more than 20% of Estonian territory is covered by protected areas, and almost 19% of marine areas is protected. We have put significant efforts to maintain and restore of semi-natural grasslands, which are areas of the richest habitats of biodiversity in our latitude. We have restored 15,000 hectares of bogs, habitats of huge contribution to long-term carbon sequestration and storage. Estonia also has unique experience in the restoration of the population of European mink. After 20 years of hard work, the rehabilitation process of one of the most endangered mammals in Europe has been successful. To conclude, I would like to urge you all to agree on ambitious targets for biodiversity to build a shared future for all. This is the last we can do. Thank you.
I thank Your Excellency for your statement, and I now give the floor to the Minister of Environment, Fisheries and Sustainable Development of Chad, His Excellency Mr. Mohamed Abdelrahim Hano, to be followed by Ukraine. Your Excellency, I give you the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished ministers and delegates, allow me to congratulate Canada as well as the government of China for having organized this COP-15 on biodiversity. Ladies and gentlemen, Chad supports the proposals made by Kenya for the African group. You will agree with me that the degradation of the ecosystems and anthropic pressures, as well as illicit trade of species, contribute to the problems of climate change and deterioration of biodiversity. Despite considerable efforts to strengthen biodiversity, we have to observe that the degradation is on the rise. A perfect illustration of this phenomenon is the shrinking of Lake Chad, which has lost 90% of its water resources in 60 years. The waters of Lake Chad are home to the vast majority of the country's fish species, and the basin is home to more than 30 million people. In line with its commitments to biodiversity, Chad has taken significant steps, notably through the creation of new protected areas, bringing the total number to 11, covering about 12 million hectares. That's 12% of the national area. And from this point of view, we support the ambition to increase the surface area of conservation areas to 30% globally. But this will require many efforts to mobilize resources and the sharing of benefits when it comes to DSI and strengthening capacity building in the post-2020 period. Aware of the vulnerability of its ecosystems and the poor performance in the implementation of the 2011 to 2020 Strategic Plan on Biodiversity, as well as the failure to achieve the Aichi targets, the government of the Republic of Chad is concerned that the present framework may suffer the same fate. That's why Chad would like to call on all stakeholders to reverse this negative trend. Chad's ambition is to take up a major challenge, which is to restore 750,000 square kilometers of degraded land, hence the need to support the objective of increasing the restoration of degraded ecosystems by 30% by 2030. And this is why, from this seat, we solemnly appeal to all partners to redouble their efforts to support Chad in its ambition to preserve and conserve its biodiversity. Moreover, we strongly support the proposal to create a special framework to support biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
I thank Your Excellency for your statement, and now give the floor to the Minister of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine, His Excellency Mr. Ruslan Stradlets. After him will be Timor-Leste. Your Excellency, I give the floor.
Dear Excellencies, dear participant, imagine that on February 24, with the news about the explosions in Kyiv, you were told what would happen next. You were told about the challenges that the Ukrainian people would have to face, about Kharkiv, about Mariupol, Bucha, Irpin, about the horrors of the occupation of Kherson, about nuclear terror, about people sitting in cold and dark bomb shelters for weeks. Would you believe that Ukraine survives? Today is the 296 days of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine has not only survived as a state, but also continues to fight for human values. Ukraine defends not only its people, but also humanity. Our state is a habitat of about 74,000 species of flora and fauna. By destroying our home, Russia is also destroying their home. Russian occupiers are trying to destroy all of Ukraine, thus endangering more than a third of Europe's biodiversity. Most of the fighting takes place in the lap of nature. Example of the Russians' destructive impact includes damaging 16 wetlands of international importance with an area of about 600,000 hectares, 160 areas of the Emerald Network, etc. Recently, our President Vladimir Zelensky told the world about the mass deaths of dolphins in the Black Sea due to the hydraulic impact. We have recorded several hundred cases of dolphin deaths. We are afraid to even imagine the scale of the tragedy after the occupation of territory and seas. Thousands of dolphins in the Black Sea could have died. Today, Ukraine is the most contaminated with landmines country in the world. Every mine is a death of animal. Almost every week, Russia launches massive missile strikes. These strikes destroy the healthy living environment not only for the human species. More than 4,700 missiles have already been launched at Ukraine. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is the most important document of the COP-15. It is a roadmap for contracting parties on how to address all the challenges biodiversity is facing. With its war, Russia is destroying the UN agreement on the preservation of biodiversity. In violation of the UN Charter, Russia disregards the General Assembly resolution and multiplies by zero our efforts to save flora and fauna. We call on to limit the participation of Russian delegation in the adoption of decisions and resolution of the Convention. In accordance with the UN General Assembly resolution aggression against Ukraine adopted by the UN member states, we call on for continued joint efforts to stop Russian aggression. Let me remind you of the answer of Margaret Mead, an outstanding anthropologist of the 20th century, to the question of the earliest sign of civilization. According to her, human civilization did not originate either from clay pots, nor weapons or craft. It was formed when people learned how to treat leg bone fractures. In the animal world, a creature with a broken leg has almost no chance to survive. It can't hunt, can't find the water, or run from a predator. A human is the first living creature that learned how to heal a broken leg, to take care, to protect from danger, to feed and bandage a wound, not to abandon to their fate. Russia today is not just destroying nature. It developed those principles that humankind has been developing during all of its history, to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. I call on you to do everything possible to stop Russian aggression. This will help save not only the natural richness in the heart of Europe, but also human values. Glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank you for your intervention. I received the notification by the Secretariat that the representative of East Timor Timor-Leste is not here. So I now give the floor to the Minister of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry of Zimbabwe, His Excellency Mr. Mangaliso Lova. After that, it will be Samoa. Your Excellency, I give you the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the government of Zimbabwe would like to thank the People's Republic of China and the government of Canada for the successful hosting of COP-15. As we gather here today to negotiate and adopt the post-2020 GBF and reflect on progress that we have made in the implementation of various decisions and resolutions from our previous meetings, Zimbabwe is pleased to have participated in various engagements during the intersessional period, including active participation in the development of the draft GBF from the onset. The 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature is achievable if we work together and walk the talk, if we walk with nature at all levels. Excellencies, the loss of biodiversity is extremely worrying and calls for nations to take practical measures to stem this imminent catastrophe. This rapid decline of biodiversity has serious implications for humanity, ranging from the collapse of food production, economic decline, and compromise of health systems, among others. We strongly believe that the post-2020 GBF will provide parties with the necessary guidance and catalyze support for biodiversity conservation. Zimbabwe is endowed with diverse flora and fauna species, soil and agricultural biodiversity that are of immense conservation value to our national economy. Biodiversity is the cornerstone of my country's economy and the livelihoods of the majority of our people. Our protected area network coverage is a combined total area of about 26% of Zimbabwe's total land area. This makes up what Zimbabwe describes as a well-connected network of biodiverse ecosystems, including trans-frontier conservation area initiatives. Access to a healthy and clean environment is a constitutional right for all Zimbabweans, and to deliver on this mandate, as a government, we continue to strive to combat the triple planetary crisis we face of biodiversity loss, pollution, and climate change. Improved financing, continuous engagement of stakeholders, including local communities, gender mainstreaming, enhanced law enforcement, and establishment of trans-frontier conservation areas with neighboring countries have all contributed significantly to biodiversity conservation. Zimbabwe has also embarked on a 5-year nationwide wetland restoration initiative, targeting ecological restoration of 350,000 hectares of degraded wetlands in a bid to restore the ecological integrity of the wetland ecosystems and their dependent flora and fauna species. Furthermore, Zimbabwe recently completed its first ever biodiversity economy report, which is the first step towards economic valuation of our biological assets. We are now taking the necessary steps to develop a natural capital accounting framework, which will include measuring the flow of ecosystem services. This approach will ensure that the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use are coherent and consistent. Excellencies, while Zimbabwe has registered this progress in biodiversity conservation, greater strides will be taken with the post-2020 GBF coming into effect. As we set new targets and goals, new funding streams and more financial resources, technology transfer, capacity building, and knowledge management systems are critical inputs for the achievement of set targets. A robust resource mobilization strategy is key, as we require sustainable, reliable, and an uninterrupted flow of resources to finance restoration and conservation projects in the long run. We are hopeful that the GBF will close the financing gap and ensure that there is fair and equitable access to finances for developing nations such as my country. Zimbabwe fully supports the establishment of a dedicated Global Biodiversity Fund as determined in Articles 20 and 21 of the Convention, as it will ensure steady flow of resources to developing parties as envisaged under Target 19.1 of the GBF. Going forward, the government of Zimbabwe is committed to continue mainstreaming biodiversity and ecosystem services within and across all policies and sectors, as well as develop a national biodiversity finance plan to ensure smooth flow of resources to biodiversity conservation. I thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your statement. I was informed by the Secretariat that Samoa's representative is not in the room at the present time. So now we have completed the interventions by ministers. I thank you all, ministers, for your intervention. We now have some time. We'll give the time to the organizations. I first of all would like to invite the representative, the Executive Secretary of Convention of Migratory Species, Amy Frankel. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to speak on behalf of the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, CMS. CMS is the only global UN treaty that is focused on the conservation of migratory species and their habitats. Migratory species are an integral part of nature and healthy ecosystems. They provide important functions such as pest control, pollination, and seed dispersal, are a source of food, fiber, and other products, and generate millions of dollars in jobs from a variety of sectors, including tourism. Yet, we are losing wild species of animals at an unprecedented rate. And the pressures on wild animals and their habitats are expected to grow exponentially, with millions of kilometers of new roads, massive increases in energy infrastructure, major human population growth, urban expansion, food insecurity, and climate change. So what can we do? Migratory species need to be able to move and to access different habitats during their annual cycles, across national borders and even continents. Thus, a key CMS priority is to enhance ecological connectivity around the world, supporting ecological functions for both wild animals and humans. Connectivity is also a powerful tool for addressing restoration and climate change, as well as zoonotic disease, and can provide a kind of roadmap for identifying areas that need conservation or restoration and those more suitable for economic activities. It is an approach which reflects the way of nature itself and offers a clear vision for the future, where nature and human activities are not at odds with one another. Connectivity has become one of the buzzwords of this COP-15, and I am happy to see that it is well reflected in the GBF in Goal A, Target 1 on spatial planning, Target 2 on restoration, Target 3 on area-based conservation, and Target 5 on urban areas. Another key priority for CMS, of course, is addressing the conservation and sustainable use of migratory species of wild animals. Our work will directly contribute to the achievement of Target 4 on the recovery, conservation, and prevention of extinction of threatened species. Our work will also directly contribute to Targets 5 and 9, tackling domestic wildlife harvesting, use, and trade, to ensure that any harvesting, use, and trade of wild species is sustainable, legal, and safe, while supporting legal and sustainable use by Indigenous peoples and local communities. We look forward to working with governments, UN colleagues, and partners and stakeholders on ensuring the effective implementation of these targets and others, along with all other parts of the GBF relevant to the mandate of CMS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Franco, Executive Secretary of CMS, for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of African Union Commission, Commissioner for Euro Economy and Agriculture, Madam Josepha Sacco. Madam, you have the floor.
Your Excellencies, this statement is read on behalf of the African Union Commission as well as the AUDA NEPAD. We would like to express our appreciation to the governments of Canada as well as the People's Republic of China. And would also want to register our appreciation to the Executive Secretary of CBD Secretariat and her staff for the logistics as well as technical guidance. Your Excellencies, we consider the Global Biodiversity Framework as a passport for the world that is in harmony with nature. And as a continent, we also peg our hopes on the Global Biodiversity Framework as the foundation of international cooperation to save the world. However, we are of the opinion that this will require the cooperation of everybody, and it will also need everybody to make a contribution, including women, youth, governments, as well as the private sector. As a continent, we remain committed to multilateralism, and we know that together with the rest of the world, we are stronger and will be able to deliver on the biodiversity framework. And Africa's common position is actually informed by the aspirations of Agenda 2063, as well as various frameworks, including the AU strategy to combat illegal exploitation of world fauna and flora, and the strategy on blue economy. As a continent that is committed to issues of biodiversity, we feel that we need to negotiate in good faith, and we need to make sure that all other parties play a fair game. And in this regard, we are concerned by the reluctance of others to commit to the implementation mechanisms that are needed for the Global Biodiversity Framework. And as Africa, we call for concerted efforts in making sure that the framework is accompanied by a dedicated fund, but in addition to that, also a global multilateral mechanism for access and benefit sharing that is linked to DSI. And on this note, allow us to commend the African group of negotiators and our member states who have demonstrated their commitment to the framework. On this note, I submit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, AU, for the statement. I now give the floor to the UN Mandate on Human Rights and Environment, Mr. David Boyd, UN Special Rapporteur, to take the floor. Sir, you have the floor. It seems Mr. Boyd is not in room at the moment. In that case, I give the floor to the UN WTO Director for Sustainable Development of Tourism, Dr. Dirk Glasser. You have the floor, sir.
Excellencies, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates. First of all, I transmit to you the greetings of UNWTO Secretary-General Suor Pololikashvili. I would like to express our gratitude to both the governments of the People's Republic of China as the presidency of COP-15, as well as to Canada as the host of the second part of the conference. There is no sector like tourism for nature. In economic terms, I address you today on behalf of one of the largest economic sectors. Tourism represents 10% of global GDP and 1 out of 10 jobs in the world. Tourism is a priority sector in many countries with many direct and multiplier effects for job creation and poverty reduction. But the characteristics of tourism make it also a unique activity, different to many others. Tourism is a highly diversified activity involving many actors along the value chain. It affects livelihoods of millions of people, plays a key role in protecting culture and biodiversity, fosters peace and understanding, and if well managed, can act as an agent of change and thus have an important multiplier role, helping to accelerate sustainable consumption and production patterns. This role of an agent of change was recognized at COP-15 in Cancun, in the Cancun Declaration, and through Decision 13/3. Biodiversity is at the center of many tourism-related activities. 65% of all national tourism policy make direct reference to biodiversity, and more than 50% describe biodiversity as an important element for attracting visitors to their destination. But the role of healthy environments was also recognized as a barrier for future pandemics by the G20 tourism ministers in 2021, welcome UNWTO's recommendations for a green transformation. However, we need to accelerate action and implementation. Two important action frameworks, the Global Tourism Plastics Initiative and the Glasgow Declaration on Climate Action and Tourism, are already widely supported in the tourism sector, focusing on two lines of action: circularity and climate action. At this COP-15, the World Tourism Organization, the World Travel and Tourism Council, and the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance announced our collaboration, bringing the sector together on the shared nature-positive vision for travel and tourism to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Signatories to the vision from the travel and tourism sector have committed to adopt a nature-positive approach to tourism through integrating biodiversity safeguards, reducing carbon emissions, the impact of pollution, the unsustainable use of resources to protect and restore nature and its wildlife. This new alliance is supporting inspiring governments, businesses and society to implement the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and together help transform humanity's relationship with nature. This involves minimizing ongoing harm and taking positive action to restore nature to produce an overall benefit to biodiversity and help achieve net zero. To conclude, UNWTO and our partners from the travel and tourism sector are committed to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. We are committed to a nature-positive approach. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Glasser, for the statement. I now give the floor to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, Mr. Boyd. You have the floor, sir. Again, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment. Sir, are you in the room? Well, it seems that he's not. In that case, I'll give the floor to the next speaker. I invite Global Biodiversity Information Facility, Dr. Joe Miller. Sir, you have the floor.
He's in the wrong chair, so just move it again.
Thank you, Mr. President. Implementing the framework of goals and targets to be agreed by COP-15 will depend on the availability of the best available data, shared from and accessible to all nations, documenting the diversity of life and how it is changing. Target 20, with its focus on the availability of data, information, and knowledge for decision-making, will thus be critical in enabling the achievement of the entire global biodiversity framework. In the 21 years since GBIF was established, our network of participating countries and organizations has developed an advanced and trusted technical and human infrastructure supported by a suite of tools and guidance materials that now represent an essential resource to support the data and information needs of an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The Global Biodata Coalition Board, a forum of research funders, announced today that GBIF is an essential global core biodata resource. GBIF enables data from a wide variety of sources, from field surveys, taxonomic literature and research studies, citizen science networks, natural history collections, and more recently, through emerging technologies such as environmental DNA monitoring, to be shared and combined in near real time into a single knowledge base, freely accessible for research and decision makers and the general public. GBIF has well-established programs to enhance capacity to mobilize and use biodiversity data for research and decisions, helping to build communities of practice and develop the skills needed to scale up sharing and application of data in all regions. We are working with business, the financial sector, and multilateral development banks to support the sharing and use of biodiversity data, contributing to transparent disclosure of impacts, as well as filling data gaps. Finally, GBIF offers shared infrastructure and services that reduce costs and efforts for governments wishing to build national biodiversity information systems, including through the CBD clearinghouse mechanism. We invite all parties, stakeholders, and funders to explore the facilities that GBIF offers, avoiding the need for reinvention, providing a core component for the exciting new knowledge services being presented at this meeting. Please join us. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for your statement. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Juan Lucas Restropo, Director General of the Alliance of Biodiversity International Center for Tropical Agriculture. I'll give you the floor.
Distinguished colleagues, a large part of the scientific community expects the biodiversity crisis to be as severe a threat as climate change. 1 million of the planet's 8 million species on Earth are threatened with extinction. As agriculture and food production covers 38% of the world's surface, it is one of the major factors contributing directly or indirectly to biodiversity loss. But we must also recognize that there is great potential to ensure that agriculture becomes a positive contributor to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. As we gather here at COP-15 amid a climate crisis, we have the opportunity to agree on concrete and accelerated evidence-based actions. CGIAR is ready to support governments to design and implement ambitious national biodiversity strategies and action plans. This requires building strong collaborations within countries under what is now being called a whole-of-government approach. Moving rapidly towards implementation of the new global biodiversity framework is crucial. And while this can seem challenging, there are existing proven approaches available that can be adapted to different contexts in support of the implementation of the framework. Our organization, with a footprint in more than 100 countries across the Global South, is ready to support these efforts. Our research can support, in particular, to halt the conversion of natural ecosystems to agricultural land by improving the productivity, profitability, and resilience of agri-food ecosystems through biodiversity-friendly practices. Shift towards biodiversity-friendly production practices such as agroecological transitions, agroforestry, and regenerative agriculture that can not only help to regenerate those ecosystems, but also prevent further degradation. Formulate transformative policies and interventions to promote markets that reward food producers for adopting biodiversity-friendly practices and incentivize sustainable consumption models. And devise and implement ambitious food systems pathways compatible with the Plant Treaty and the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing in mutually supportive ways, as well as related to the generation and use of digital sequence information. Ladies and gentlemen, each one of us sees the world in different ways, and yet, as COP-15 comes to an end, we are called to reach a consensus on the new framework and ensure that all nations can access the public and private funds necessary for implementation, rapidly reducing their dependence on harmful environmental subsidies and shifting them to support biodiversity-friendly practices. Biodiversity loss is a global crisis affecting all of us. We need to act together to build a prosperous future for all life on Earth. At the end of the day, our lives as human beings depend on the nature that surrounds us. There will be no future for humans without a future for nature. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
谢谢雷斯特雷伯总干事，谢谢您的发言。下面我
Thank you, DG, for your statement. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Shamala Sakuru, Executive Director of the International Tropical Timber Organization. I'll give the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Honourable Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may the ITTO offer our congratulations to the governments of China and Canada for the successful hosting of the CBD COP-15 in the wonderful city of Montreal. We would also like to express our sincere appreciation to Madame Executive Secretary of the CBD Secretariat and her team for their commitment to the COP-15, as well as to all delegates who have diligently worked hard over the almost 2 weeks now in the negotiating process. The ITTO is the only intergovernmental organization that is mandated on tropical forests. We consist of 75 members, all of whom are also parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the UNFCCC. We are hosted with the generous support from the government of Japan. The dual mandate on the sustainable management of tropical forests and the diversification of trade in forest products from legally and sustainably managed tropical forests underlines the importance of tropical forestry, which is still very central to the CBD and the UNFCCC. ITTO's membership accounts for 80% of tropical forestry globally and 90% of the trade in tropical forest products. Simultaneously, the tropics are home to 70% of global population who live in extreme poverty, and on a brighter note, is also home to nearly 70% of global terrestrial biodiversity. Ladies and gentlemen, the nexus between sustainably managed tropical forests, biodiversity, and climate change mitigation and adaptation are inseparable. They need to be tackled and viewed holistically. ITTO's work, governed by the International Tropical Timber Agreement under the auspices of UNCTAD, is fully committed to global commitments which encompass the CBD, UNFCCC, CITES, IUCN, etc. Yet, tropical forests, both terrestrial and coastal, remain increasingly susceptible and vulnerable to land use change, deforestation, and degradation due to the urgent need for food, wood, and energy security. The global community must change in how it interacts with sustainably managed tropical forests, which can only ensure biodiversity conservation for future generations. ITTO implores the delegations here to reach consensus on the GBF, the DSI, and also on resource mobilization to enable sustainably managed tropical forests to continue to contribute positively to almost all the Sustainable Development Goals. We would also urge delegations here to welcome collaboration and strategic investment in IGOs such as the ITTO, who are well experienced in the successful implementation of scalable, replicable, and transferable projects on the ground. The implementation of the GBF, once agreed, would need to focus on the sustainable management of tropical forests, stemming from the legality and sustainability of tropical forests, which will only ensure the sustained longevity and the sustainable use of biodiversity, water resources, and carbon sinks and sequestration, while being substitutes for environmentally harmful materials and simultaneously produce the oxygen that we breathe. It will simultaneously enrich the livelihoods of forest communities and indigenous peoples, leaving no one behind. ITTO is committed to a nature-positive world, and we are here to work with all of you. Please help us to help you. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank you, Sadhguru, for your statement. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Lorna Slater, Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Biodiversity of Regions for Sustainable Development. You have the floor.
Chairs, co-chairs, and distinguished delegates, I address you on behalf of Regions for Sustainable Development, a network of 42 subnational leaders that brings together subnational governments from across the world for ambitious action on climate, biodiversity, and localization of the Sustainable Development Goals. We are also coordinators of the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments to the Convention on Biological Diversity, alongside the Government of Quebec. For the past 2 years, Regions 4 has partnered with the Edinburgh Process leaders, led by the Scottish Government, to promote a whole-of-government approach within the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Today, we can be proud of our efforts and honoured to see the increasing recognition of local and subnational governments, particularly in the implementation of the new Global Biodiversity Goals. Over 300 of us, local and subnational governments, have signed and committed to the Edinburgh Declaration, the call for action led by the Scottish Government that we at Regions 4, together with our host region, Quebec, have been advocating for over the last 2 years. The results of the 7th Summit for Subnational and Local Governments and the stronger than ever engagement of local and subnational leaders gathered here in Montreal have reinforced our ambitions as well as our intentions to play a stronger role in implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Therefore, we welcome the discussions on item 16B regarding the engagement with subnational governments, cities and other local authorities to enhance implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and see it and its plan of action as the means to materialize these intentions. We call on the parties to use these instruments as a strategic tool to bridge the gap between national commitments and subnational implementation. We have the highest hopes that COP-15 will mark a pivotal moment at which we, as leaders, driven by a whole-of-government approach, bend the curve on nature loss by providing real and innovative solutions and making concrete commitments to do our part in protecting our natural heritage and the biodiversity upon which all life depends. Thank you.
Thank you, Slater, for your statement. Now I give the floor to Ms. Amanda Blanc, founding board member of the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation. I give you the floor.
Dear Presidency, Excellencies and parties to the CBD, evidently I am replacing Amanda Blanc as Speaker. I am Jan-Erik Saugestad, CEO of Storebrand Asset Management, and speaking to you today on behalf of Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, a 126-strong group of financial institutions representing 21 countries that have signed the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge. We have all signed this pledge because we recognize the severity of the biodiversity loss and also the role finance has to play in reversing it. Finance is vital to the economy, and it is also vital to the protection of global diversity. We all saw the power of the Paris Agreement in stimulating action on climate change from the private financial sector, and now we need to treat biodiversity loss with the same level of urgency and tackle it with the same depth of collaboration. According to the World Economic Forum, more than half of world's global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. And most global financial capital, with a magnitude of hundreds of trillions of dollars, moves around with little recognition of its impact or dependency upon nature. We can change that if the Global Biodiversity biodiversity framework clearly will refer to finance from all sources so that public and the private sector can come together to bridge the finance gap on nature and significantly increase the financial resources committed to tackling biodiversity loss. Stimulating new sources on nature is important, but next to this, it is crucial that the existing financial flows are aligned with the goals and targets of the framework. The public sector can increase its funding exponentially, but that funding will be less effective if other, namely private financial flows, remain aligned with trajectories that destroy biodiversity. So, what do the parties need to achieve? Over the past, we've urged governments to address the two main issues in the global biodiversity framework: alignment of all financial flows and mandatory disclosure. We have called the governments to address alignment of all flows, both private and public, with the GBF. Secondly, the alignment relies on mandatory disclosure. Not having mandatory reporting by companies is preventing financial institutions in aligning their financial flow and playing a more positive role for nature. Currently, the voluntary nature of disclosure creates an unlevel playing field between companies and thereby an incomplete basis for us as investors to align financial flows with the global biodiversity framework. It's been a good road to Montreal, but it's the road from Montreal that is crucial. And for that, we need a good roadmap. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I'd like to once again give the floor to Mr. David Boyd, the UN Special Rapporteur, representing the UN mandate on human rights and the environment. Sir, you have the floor. 非常感谢。
Ladies and gentlemen, the awe-inspiring diversity of life on Earth is in grave danger. We've heard the statistics: 1 million species at risk of extinction, wildlife populations have declined by 70%. The global nature crisis is a human rights crisis, affecting the rights to life, health, food, water, a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the rights of the child, and cultural rights. We all depend on plants and plankton for the oxygen in the air we breathe. We all depend on soil microorganisms and pollinators for the food we eat. But biodiversity's decline is most devastating for the people who most directly depend on it. For example, Indigenous peoples are struggling to defend the lands and waters they depend on for their human rights, defending those lands and waters from the insatiable appetites of extractive industries. Small-scale fishers and their rights are being harmed by industrial overfishing and the die-off of coral reefs. We know that human rights-based approaches are the most effective and equitable way forward to conserve, protect, restore, sustainably use, and equitably share the benefits of nature. There are 3 reasons for this. First, rights-based approaches are catalysts for accelerated environmental action to protect biodiversity, as we have seen in leading nations such as Costa Rica, the Maldives, and Slovenia. Second, rights-based approaches ensure accountability through institutions and processes that are lacking in environmental treaties such as the Convention on Biodiversity. And third, rights-based approaches confirm that we have to focus on the most vulnerable and marginalized populations to meet their needs and fulfill their rights. It is completely unacceptable to evict Indigenous people from their traditional territories to create protected areas. There is compelling scientific evidence that human rights-based conservation works. Look at the Indigenous-led protected areas of Canada and Australia, the community conservancies of Namibia, When Indigenous people manage their traditional territories, they are very effective at conserving biodiversity. In fact, as successful or more successful than government-managed protected areas. The Aichi biodiversity targets did not mention the words human rights at all. It's a key reason why those targets were not fully met. And with time running out to protect and restore nature, we must learn from the mistakes of the past. Human rights and nature's health are inextricably interconnected. Without human rights, effective conservation is impossible. And without effective conservation, the full enjoyment of human rights is impossible. Ladies and gentlemen, it is essential that human rights-based approaches be placed at the very heart of the global biodiversity framework. Human rights, Indigenous rights, the rights of women and girls, and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment must be included in the principles such as BBIS, Goal B, and the targets and indicators. For our children, this is our last best chance to protect nature. Thank you very much.
Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, that brings me to the end of my list for the current session. I thank you for your close cooperation, and I thank all the speakers. And I declare the plenary session of this high-level segment adjourned. We will reconvene tomorrow morning, continuing with the order of speakers. Thank you.